What are some of the factors of modernity, say, the past 100 to 200 years that, despite our purported enlightenment, which a lot of people trumpet, have contributed to the continued proliferation up to the present of genocides across the world?
So some people will argue, actually, that genocide is a modern phenomenon. In other words, that some people say what happened in prehistory or medieval period or early modern period is not genocide. I was one of those at one point. When I wrote that first book, Fires of Hatred, it was about 20th century Europe. And I made the argument there that there were elements of modernity, that were crucial for genocide. Some of them being things like censuses, modern weapons, and the ability to identify people, and the ability to, move large numbers of people, by rail or whatever, to specific destinations. Modern racism. So there's a particular kind of racism that comes at the end of the 19th and beginning of 20th century, where, as I mentioned, the Spanish already had ideas of racism, where, the blood of Jews and Muslims was different from that of the Spanish Christians. So they already had this idea of kind of blood. But the kind of modern racism that comes, again, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, influenced by, Darwin and by neo-Darwinists. Darwin's not to blame. It's his followers who have a lot to do with this. Start saying that, you're inferior, because of your, who you are, your nature, that we're all different. That was already clear from the beginning of the 19th century, people like Herder, who said, well, every nation is a little bit different. But then, at the end of the 19th century, people began to make hierarchies of nation, of peoples, and they're superior peoples and they're inferior peoples. And they made a science out of it, in kind of neo-Darwinist terms. And there were a number of thinkers, who developed this idea that then was picked up, of course, by people like Hitler, who then in Mein Kampf, set forth this whole racial theory of people's existence. So this modern nationalism is really crucial to modernity. And, you could walk like a German, you could talk like a German, you could dress like a German, you could do everything German, but you weren't German if you had a Jewish grandmother. Well, that's the kind of racialism that, wasn't there at the beginning of the 19th century. Where if you walk like a German, you look like a German, you talk like a German, you had converted to Christianity, you were a German, right? That changes at the end of the 19th century, and that changes for a lot of people. And this goes sometimes for indigenous peoples as well. If they converted, if they dressed, talked, walked, and it had everything but let's say a darker skin, they were acceptable frequently into society. The same thing with the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. If they looked and acted like everybody else, they were fully accepted. I guess the point is that modernity has a certain ideology behind it, as well as a technology behind it. So the technology I mentioned, has to do with communications. It has to do with modern weaponry. It has to do with, you can shoot a whole lot more people with a machine gun than you can with a, single loading carbine. And, it's just a level of technology, that makes possible, the kind of genocides we've seen in the 20th century. Even something like barbed wire, was invented at a certain point in the late 19th century, I think. And then, using barbed wire and to keep people in big pens, that was not possible earlier on. So, modernity has, certain, mentalities to it, as well as technologies as well as political systems. I mean, that's the other piece of the story. So, a kind of political system, that makes it possible to mobilize people in genocidal situations. So that's sort of how I would say it. But I still think that genocide goes back in all the way into history, and that you can periodize it. You can say, okay, modern genocides may be a little bit different because of the technological and also ideological backgrounds to them, but it's part of the same phenomenon. The intentional killing of a group of people, or all of people.
When you say that modernity has its own kind of mentalities, the first thing that immediately came to my mind was the industrial mentality, and you can see how that manifested itself in the Holocaust. But one thing before we get to the Armenian genocide is,
by the way, not just in the Holocaust, but in the Soviet case as well. We have Soviet modernity, and whether they put people in these gulags where they're working in big factories and in mines and stuff like that, and many of them die, right? And so you have, in the creation of modern industry, the Industrial Revolution at the beginning of the 19th century, but then the kind of, merging of that with race and with
war.
Certain technological innovations and weaponry and that kind of thing, does make for a kind of special 20th century nasty mix.